pretty simple. The microphone
everyone. It's lovely to see a crowded room. I'm happy you're here. My name is Philip Napoli. I am the Dean of the School of Humanities and Social Sciences. And on behalf of today's sponsors, it's my honor to welcome our speaker, Jamelle Bouie, to Brooklyn College. Mr. Bouie joins us at a time and in a week when it feels to many of us that the foundations on which this country have been built and have survived are being tested once again. Earlier today, The Economist newspaper, a publication which asserts it has no permanent address on the left or right scale, has written that President Trump's actions since the inauguration have launched us into a fight over the fundamental character of America. For this reason, I look forward to learning from the wisdom of Mr. Bouie as he shares with us what he describes as a post-inauguration reassessment of U.S. democracy. Before turning to Mr. Bouie, I would like to introduce our lead organizer for today's event, Professor Anna Law. Professor Law is an associate professor of political science and Herbert Kerr's chair of constitutional rights at Brooklyn College. She specializes in U.S. constitutional law and development, the history and politics of federal courts, and U.S. immigration history. Anna is in the last months of a 16-year-long project called The Politics of U.S. Mobility, Voluntary and Involuntary Migration, 1619 to 1888, which is a retelling of U.S. immigration policy history alongside African American and Native American history. That book is due out from Oxford University Press in 2026. We are proud of Professor Law's leadership and eager to learn from Mr. Bouie. Anna, please.
Thank you and welcome everyone. I wanted to say a few words about how we are able to gather here, and it's because of our alumnus Herbert Kerr, who so today I want to say a few words about him, introduce our distinguished speaker, and thank a number of people who helped make this happen. Herbert Kerr was an alumnus of Brooklyn College. He was an economics major. He graduated in 1941. In 1965, he founded Presidential Life, a successful insurance and annuity business based in Nyack, New York. And that now is part of Athene Annuity and Life Insurance Company of New York. Herbert's son, Len, told me that Presidential Life would go out of its way to hire racial minorities and women at a time before that was widespread practice and before there was even a name for what they were doing. Herbert and his wife Edith founded the Kerr Family Foundation, and that has funded a number of charities in Rockland County and has also provided significant support to Brooklyn College, including the endowed chair that I have held for 13 years. Herbert Kerr passed away in 2014, but his vision and his commitment to social justice and racial justice lives on. Let me now turn to introducing our distinguished visitor today. The United States is in uncharted waters, and we are in the middle of a constitutional crisis with a sustained attack on both the rule of law and our democracy. So using constitutional scholar Jack Balkin and Sandy Levinson's definition of a constitutional crisis, I'll make the analogy that it's like a person having a health crisis, like a stroke or a heart attack, not a cold, or even the flu. There are three outcomes of a constitutional crisis. Either the U.S. survives, weathers the storm, and is none the worse for wear, and it continues going on the same as it ever was. Number two, the U.S. survives, but in much weakened form. Think of someone who's had a stroke or heart attack. They survived, but they get tired very easily. They can't do stairs, that kind of thing. And the third option is the U.S. experiences regime change and our democracy ceases to be. So think of a regime change like the collapse of the Soviet Union. I can think of no one better to help us process the current moment than Jamelle Bouie. He's our nation's most eminent political columnist, and he has a deep understanding of U.S. history and not just the present. So I was in an academic conference in New Orleans last semester, and it was dinner time, and the host told us, please take a seat. So it's like musical chairs where when the music stops, you gotta sit near a seat. And next to me is Jamelle Bouie. How often is that gonna happen? So I proceeded through dinner to explain to him what we do at CUNY and why our students are awesome. Now, because he wanted to eat dinner, he couldn't leave. So this is why he's visiting today. I heard today that we have what, how many CUNY campuses? This is the first visit to any CUNY campus. So of course, obviously, he chose the best CUNY. He is based in Charlottesville, Virginia, even though he writes a column for the New York Times. And he covers history and politics and a fair amount of constitutional law. Before the New York Times, Jamelle was chief political correspondent for Slate magazine. And he began his career at the American Prospect magazine and contributed and also spent some time at the Daily Beast. He has contributed essays to volumes such as 400 Souls, A Community History of African America, 1619 to 2019, and of course you all know the 1619 Project, A New Origin Story. In 2021, he received the Hillman Prize for Opinion and Analysis in Journalism, and in 2024, he was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Before I turn the podium over to Jamelle, I also want to thank the Wolf Institute, especially Gaston Alonso and Kiana Benjamin. If you see that they're here today, if you see them, thank them early and often, because I couldn't have pulled this off without their help. I also want to thank Professor Ben Karp for his Daniel Lyon Chair funds that helped pay for this event. And thanks to the over 20 departments and units around the campus who co-sponsored. The reason why we have a big turnout is because of those departments and units. If you're a student and you didn't sign in, please sign in on the way out. The event is being recorded and you can find it again at the Wolf Institute YouTube channel. Finally, some order of operations. We have limited time with Jamelle today because he is literally leaving our campus to catch a plane. And so I ask that everyone hold their comments until he's done with his remarks. And during open Q&A, that you limit your questions to topics relevant and germane to his talk. So help me welcome Jamelle Bouie to his first CUNY visit.
Says don't pull on the microphone, and I immediately pulled on the microphone. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here at Brooklyn College. A real pleasure to be on a CUNY campus. So I'm really happy to be here. I apologize if I'm going to be drinking a lot of water. I'm getting over the flu. Everyone get your flu shot. It's important. So I'll be just drinking a lot of water to keep my voice going. This is water, not vodka. Post-inauguration assessment of democracy. It's crazy that it's only a month after inauguration. I realized that when I woke up this morning, and I was like, oh, it's February 20th, I'm giving this talk, and it's exactly 1 month since the inauguration, but it feels so much longer. I feel like, Rose and Titanic. It's been 80 years. It's been so long since Trump got back in office, but it's only been 1 month. And I think it's useful, just before I get started, to go through some of what has transpired in this month since Trump got back into office. So I'm going to go through um, a set of facts about what Trump has done. Not going to offer any interpretation as I tell you these facts. I'm going to give this as straight as I can possibly give it to you. You may notice how I feel about it from my intonation, but no commentary. So Trump is inaugurated on January 20th, and he then pardons the 1,500 rioters responsible for January 6th. A riot he himself spurred on with his attempt to stay in power through illegal and anti-constitutional means. He issued a executive order essentially stating that he has the right to fire at will. And then he issued subsequent executive orders, and this is all in sort of the first week, which, among other things, purported to end gender-affirming care for all transgender Americans. He issued executive orders purporting to take hold of the American education system and mandate what he calls patriotic education that forbids any mention of race, gender, or inequality. His most significant order was to freeze the entire operation of the federal government in order to root out what he says is illegal DEI, illegal diversity, equity, and inclusion mechanisms. He says that these are programs that violate civil rights law, that are unconstitutional discrimination against groups of Americans. I said no commentary, but very Orwellian way of describing DEI. But he issues this freeze, and this freeze applied to all grants and most federal programs. It was threatening to cut off funding for programs like Medicaid, WIC, food stamps, in addition to ending grants for the National Science Foundation, National Institutes of Health. The freeze was blocked by the courts. Some funding continued to flow. The administration is still trying to freeze funds for various science and research grants. The big thing that has transpired, in addition to these executive orders, and there are many others, the president really seems to like to issue executive orders, is that he has directed his largest and most important donor, Elon Musk, to find efficiency in government, which so far has just meant kind of unilaterally slashing all kinds of programs, turning off funding to any program that Musk feels constitutes waste, fraud, and abuse. The first target of this was USAID, the Agency for International Development, which has been effectively turned off by Musk. Musk is targeting other areas of the federal government to turn off in this way. And every day we get new news of new firings in the federal government. Yesterday, Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, said that he is tasking DOD with finding $50 billion in savings, cutting as many people as possible who are involved in DEI and climate change. You would think that the U.S. military would want to care about climate change, but apparently not. There have been cuts to personnel in critical areas of the federal government, cuts to personnel in those parts of the Department of Energy that deal with nuclear safety. And they're trying to hire those people back, which gives you a sense of how well thought out those cuts were. Cuts to the FAA, not a couple weeks after a plane crash. Cuts to the National Park Services. Cuts everywhere. Cuts to thousands and thousands of employees. Now, it's tempting to look at this, or some people might look at this and say, well, this is all just what Americans voted for. Trump said that Musk would have a role in this administration, that they restructure things in a dramatic way. This is just how things go. You might even ask how this is different from any other president who wants to kind of clear house and get started in his own right in ways that he would like to do. But this slash and burn of the federal government gets to a critical constitutional problem and gets to this question of what is the state of U.S. democracy in this month since inauguration. Now, the critical constitutional problem is who gave Musk or even Trump the authority to do any of this? The president doesn't actually have unilateral authority to just cut congressional appropriations as he sees fit. The Constitution is quite clear that the Congress has the power of the purse. That's its principal job. If it didn't have the power of the purse, there's not really much else that Congress would do. It'd be a useless institution. I say that knowing that people think Congress is a useless institution, even with the power of the purse. But bear with me. We're gonna give some grace and benefit of the doubt to Congress. Congress would not really have much to do if it didn't have the power of the purse. The Treasury is responsible for dispersing congressional appropriations. The president is responsible for honoring and making sure congressional appropriations go through. But there's nothing that says the president can just freeze budgets, cut appropriations, fire federal employees that are there on a congressional mandate, who are there under Congress's under statutory authority provided by Congress. The president's job with regards to appropriations is more or less just to carry them out. And any discretion the president has, it has to be explicitly given to the president by Congress, or it's discretion that might be inherent in the interpretation of ambiguous instructions. But there's no inherent right to discretion, and there's no plausible reading of Article 2 of the Constitution that would confer on the president some sort of unlimited discretion when it comes to the disbursement of congressional funds. To say nothing of the fact that Elon Musk is just some guy. Yes, he's rich. Yes, he's famous. Yes, he's the president's big donor. But in a constitutional sense, he's just a guy who's there. And he has no formal presidential appointment. He wasn't confirmed by Congress. In fact, when Doge, I hate saying that so much. When the Department of Government Efficiency is before court, has been before a judge over the last 2 weeks or so, and they're asked who actually leads this, they're like, there's an administrator, but we're not going to tell you who it is, which just emphasizes the extent to which Elon Musk is just a guy who's exercising incredible authority despite having no particular constitutional sanction. So we have a newish president, who is seizing huge amounts of power to fundamentally reshape the executive branch, doing so against the explicit will of Congress, delegating some of this authority to Elon Musk, a private citizen who also has no particular constitutional authority to act here, and is essentially seizing some of the most critical power that Congress has, the power that sort of makes Congress Congress. Now I'm in the realm of interpretation, of commentary here. One way to look at all of this is to say that we have a president who is advancing a quite radical theory of executive power, in which he doesn't simply have broad discretion, but he's something like the sovereign of the entire federal government. Was it yesterday? He put out a little photo of himself as the king, as royalty. That it's easy to dismiss stuff like that as being like jokes. Why are you going to take him so seriously? But in a real sense, he is kind of claiming royal prerogative. Once you're claiming the right to cancel congressional appropriations, to ignore judicial rulings, which they're kind of creeping on, announcing that they have the right to do that. Once you're announcing that you're essentially unchecked by either the legislative or judicial branches of government, then in a real sense, you are claiming something like a royal prerogative to act. He does not believe that he can be legitimately checked by any other institution in the government, and has unleashed the richest man in the world on the federal government to unilaterally change it, to cut it as that person sees fit. And I'm skipping things here too. The entire Department of Justice shenanigans last week should be mentioned in an important abuse of power. But for now, it goes without saying that any one of the things I've mentioned would probably be grounds for impeachment and removal. I know that sounds very quaint these days. Impeachment, what's that? You know. But if like if if Bill Clinton had announced one day that Bill Gates now is the unofficial runner of the federal government, people would have been upset. You know, they wouldn't have been happy, and not because Microsoft made a bad product at the time. They'd be upset because no one elected Bill Gates to, I don't know, cut Medicaid, right? If any of this had transpired under a previous president, immediate grounds for impeachment and removal, and for good reason, because all of these changes, all of these efforts, constitute an attempt to unilaterally transform the American system of government into something less democratic, less, if you prefer, lowercase r Republican, and transform it into something much more authoritarian and much more autocratic. The vision of the executive branch and the executive being advanced here is one in which the president is something like an elected despot who can do whatever their hearts desire and whose will has to be followed and obeyed by everyone within the American political system. Reassessment of U.S. democracy. So far, my reassessment, it's not looking good. It's looking bad. This is a path the administration has put us on that leads pretty clearly, I think, to a place that looks like Orban's Hungary or Putin's Russia, a place where there may be elections, but they're not meaningful in terms of changing power, a place where you no longer have representatives who can take action on your behalf and the executive has to follow that action, but a place where your representatives have to essentially beg the sovereign for good favor, which is already happening. We're already seeing Republican lawmakers, at the very least, begging Trump to not cut appropriations that they themselves passed. That's wild to see. I'll be perfectly honest. You pass the appropriation. The law says that the president has to do it. The president says, I don't think so. And rather than exercising your constitutional authority to make the president do what you told the president to do, you go to them, hat in hand, please, Mr. President, can you give me our money back? It's pathetic. But that's the path that we're on, where we all have to relate to the president in that manner, as if he is a king, as if he is the sovereign of the country, as if we are at his mercy. If he decides that he wants to turn off funding to Medicare, turn off funding to Social Security, using his illegal control over the Treasury payment system, then we just have to hope that he doesn't target us. This is a state of affairs where ordinary American citizens, where the states are treated like vassals and subjects. And it's a world, if we continue on this path, where our fundamental assumptions about how things work have to be recalibrated, because we'd be living under, or rather the Constitution would be sanctioning a very different kind of regime than what we've been accustomed to as Americans for a long time. I think that bears some additional explanation. I think Trump is violating the Constitution, and he is. He's violating the Constitution. He's violating long-standing constitutional understandings. But constitutional meaning is also not a static thing. It's not simply one thing for all times. Constitutional meaning is often in flux, even when it appears to be stable. Some of this changing in constitutional meaning is a product of top-down activity. The Supreme Court says that one thing is the case, and then it becomes the case, at least in our law. Some of it is bottom-up. The people themselves come to a set of agreements, come to a set of conclusions about how the Constitution works, and that's just how it works. Political parties aren't in the American Constitution, but they developed in a bottom-up and top-down way, both sides, and they become part of the constitutional firmament over time. The people can have a vision of the Constitution themselves, and they can sort of force other political actors to recognize it as being the case. The changes in constitutional meaning, changing constitutional meaning, can be bottom up and top down at the same time, ratified not through formal processes, but just through practice. We've accepted this is the way things are, and this is the way they're going to be. And so my worry, 1 month post-inauguration, and in the absence of, still haven't seen any kind of pushback like what we saw, for example, in the first months of the first Trump administration. My worry is that the president is asserting new autocratic powers. You might call it, they call it, I think, the unitary executive theory, which is old hat, but I think it's something much more radical than even that. But the president asserts them, and maybe a substantial portion of the public accepts it as legitimate. And although some courts will reject him, other courts, perhaps even the Supreme Court, may give him some sanction. And his political party stands by and lets him act as he'd like. And so the Constitution in this world hasn't been changed. Like, the text is what it's been. It's even been broken in critical regards. But if there's no one directly challenging the legitimacy of any of this, if there's no one who's saying, no one in the mass public who's saying, this is not acceptable, it's not a part of our constitutional order, it cannot be allowed to stand, then it's not hard to imagine a world where this just gets liquidated, you could say, into being what the political regime is. We now have an elected despot, and Congress just offers its advice, and the courts have limited sway over what the executive does. Now, I think that even if this were to happen, if this were to come to pass, I still think someone like me would have grounds to say, well, this is also illegitimate, even if there's been this informal change in the Constitution. The actual text of the thing is still what it is. It's still the case. But the possibility of this kind of informal transformation of the constitutional order, because of actions being taken right now, because of this autocratic approach to government, it's a real possibility. And it is a reminder of something that I think is underappreciated in American political history, which is that the Constitution that we have is not the same one that was ratified back in 1788, that the Constitution can undergo fundamental change without us necessarily going through the formal process of amendment. That our kind of exceptional belief that Americans have had a singular constitution over time isn't true. The Constitution's only really remained static on paper. And while it's been this object of national worship and reverence for some time, the Constitution as an actual governing document has undergone multiple dramatic transformations. And this just might be another one of them. And we can go through what some of those transformations were. The Constitution, again, as ratified, and you could say up until the 1820s, was a very different thing. It wasn't a system where we had big mass political parties. It wasn't a system where the courts, although they were influential and powerful, had quite as influential and powerful a role as they do now. It was the political system under which the Constitution existed was much more hierarchical, much more elite-centered than the one that came after. But political controversy, the emergence of political parties, the emergence of slavery as an important political battle, sectional battle, ends up changing the Constitution a bit, changing the ground under which Americans do politics. And we get kind of a new kind of constitutional order that is legitimating a very different kind of politics, one that's defined by mass organizations, one where there's the conflict of the scope of federal power has grown dramatically, one where we are beset by all kinds of crises about the scope of federal power, the Missouri crisis, the nullification crisis, the Mexican War, and then finally in 1860, the secession crisis. And 1861 brings us a civil war, which brings us again to a new kind of American republic. The America that emerged out of the Civil War, as is widely known, is just a different thing than the one that existed before. And the Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th, changed the nature of the American Union, changed the nature of the individual's relationship to the national state, changes the nature of citizenship in the country, although these days there's some dispute about what citizenship, how the Constitution grants citizenship. But this post-Civil War Constitution, because a formal amendment in this case, is a very different beast than the one that came before. And it carries through the rest of the 19th century into the 20th century, into another period of constitutional change and renewal, and into a period of informal constitutional change, right? You can think of the New Deal period as being a set of constitutional changes, a set of changes to the way we understand what our political system is. And this is top down, this is the courts, this is bottom up, this is the public itself demanding that their government act in robust and aggressive ways, in a way that it may not have been able to in the past. And it establishes a set of things that we consider pretty integral to our constitutional order. The administrative state and large bureaucracies. A federal government that is finally taking efforts towards ameliorating conditions for ordinary people, ameliorating conditions of poverty under Johnson and the Great Society in the 60s, ameliorating conditions of unequal access to society. This is another kind of constitutional order, a different one, and it's the one that I'd say most of us were born into and sort of assumed would be the case, this more egalitarian constitutional order with a strong national state and two political parties that agreed on kind of the basics of how that state would operate and how the citizen would act and live in relation to it. So I'll say that even without Trump, even without all of this, it has been clear that there's been some sort of destabilization to that order. Attacks on civil rights laws that go back 15 years, attacks on what's left of the New Deal state, on programs like Social Security, on programs like Medicare, on the notion of the government as a powerful regulator of the economy. This has all been highly contested. And the subject of live political dispute. But there's still a sort of a sense that you could either reinforce and bolster the old New Deal order, or if there is going to be something that follows, that new thing is not going to be a complete repudiation of what came before. And what makes this moment, I think, different, truly different and unique, is that in this attempt to rip out the wires of the federal government, this Doge reform thing, what you're seeing is not an accommodation with the political order, with the constitutional order that has shaped most of the 20th and at least the first few decades of the 21st century, but an attempt to kind of completely revise, renegotiate, and transform that into something very different, where the state doesn't offer those sorts of guarantees to ordinary people, doesn't intervene on their behalf, where the commitments to inclusion, to civic equality at the very least that we associate with the post-1960s world are drawn back, are pushed back, are allowed to flail and falter until the government says no longer any of our business what happens in the society itself. Something like bringing back Plessy, but only not explicitly, but something Plessy-ish. And then turning what's left of the federal state into two things, one of which is an instrument for the president to dole out favors to friends, and an instrument for the very wealthy, the oligarch class, you could say, to secure their own wealth. An instrument of upward redistribution. It's happening, if this is where we are, through this classic pattern of informal constitutional change, right? There's been no great referendum. There's been no great plebiscite over the Constitution. Even the last election, right, was fought less over what's going to be the fate of constitutional democracy in the United States, and more over, wouldn't it be nice if eggs could cost $2 a carton? Which, they're $8 now, so we don't even get that, unfortunately. So this informal process of change that we're going through wasn't litigated in the past election, yet it's happening all the same. It's worth, I think, making a couple distinctions here. Trump is asserting these broad executive powers that he does not have, and he's sort of forcing the rest of the political system to respond to him. And, someone might say, well, the other presidents have done this too, right? Abraham Lincoln asserted broad powers in the conduct of the war. FDR asserted broad powers. But I think one of the differences in between these cases and our current one is that Lincoln, FDR, at first there's just the substantive thing that the Civil War was like a genuine crisis, the Depression was a genuine crisis, but also neither Lincoln nor FDR were claiming presidential supremacy over the rest of the political system. They were both trying to maximize their authority for the sake of resolving the crisis, but always going back to Congress, always going back to the people's elected representatives for support, for authorization, for legitimacy. And that's not what we're seeing here. They also had something of a real political mandate. Lincoln was elected in the context of what's going to happen to the future of the Union. FDR was elected to do something about the Depression. Trump, again, was not elected to reshape our constitutional order. This is his own project and that of those around him. So it's frightening, right, to see these tremendous changes being made. This attempt to assert and grab power, to say things like, the president says what the law is now, which is not true, but it's what Trump says. It's frightening to see, frightening to think that what we're witnessing is, in a lot of ways, him finishing the job of January 6th. He tried to overthrow constitutional government once, he's back in power, and he is engaged in an autocratic concentration of power around himself in order to protect himself from any kind of consequences, but also to make sure that what failed in the past could probably succeed in the future. But at the same time that he's doing all of this, there's no public sanction for it. Some polling's been coming down over the last 48 hours, and it all shows Trump kind of rapidly declining with much of the public. People unhappy with Musk's role, people unhappy with the refusal to obey the law. Large majorities of the American public saying the president should obey court orders. The public isn't necessarily on board for this. And so if this is an attempt to kind of create informal constitutional change, then it's one that is happening maybe with the support of the Republican Party, but not with the endorsement of the broad public, of the broad numbers of Americans, which is a saving grace. This is something to be, in as much as we can be happy about anything these days, this is something to be happy about, because it's a sign that there are still plenty of ways to push back, to reassert something like the old order of things. That's especially true since even the substance of what, say, Musk wants to do, of what, say, the most conservative and reactionary members of the Trump administration want to do, is not popular. Americans don't want big cuts to social insurance. Americans don't even want big cuts to DEI. This is something I find very funny. There was a Gallup poll yesterday that asked, what is your approval of the president? More people disapproved than approved. What's your approval of congressional Democrats? More people disapproved than approved. Same for Republicans, same for Elon Musk. And then it's like, what do you think about DEI? Majorities. Sounds pretty good to us, right? So even something that you might think that the public would be okay with, they're not. Which is an opportunity for opponents of the administration. It's an opportunity for those who don't want to see this sort of informal transformation of the American system take effect. It's an opportunity to push back and to begin to articulate a vision of the American system that is the more inclusive and democratic and egalitarian vision that I think that more Americans than not want to see. So what does that pushback look like in practice? Some of it is going to come from state governments who themselves can make broad constitutional claims on our behalf, who can make claims about what the proper role of the federal government is, what the proper role of the president is. You saw some of that yesterday, I believe. The governor here in New York, in responding to the administration's attempt to kill congestion pricing in New York City, said, listen, this is a nation of laws, and so we're going to contest this in courts. You can't unilaterally destroy a program that you just approved. The governor of Illinois has made himself lots of noise about opposing the administration's claims of broad executive authority. And many other institutions have looked at some of these executive orders, some of these claims of executive authority, and essentially said, listen, you can put out your little blog post, but you have no authority to tell us what to do. And those kinds of actions, explicitly pushing back against the president's claims of great authority, I think are an important part of arresting this attempt to transform the constitutional order. So much of constitutional politics in the United States is about what people believe to be true. And if people believe that the president can act in royal decree and that we all have to listen, then to a certain extent that is true. But if other actors in the society, if other constitutional actors, other political actors begin to act as if it's not true, and force the administration to have to defend itself when it makes these claims, then that is valuable pushback. And that is demonstrating that, no, the president doesn't have the kind of authority that he claims. But there's also a role here, I think, for ordinary American citizens, for all of us, for people like us, for both people like me, me giving you making this argument about what I think is happening in terms of our constitutional order, and how one should understand constitutional change and meaning, is part of beginning to articulate a kind of response that, in addition to contacting representatives and casting ballots in elections and all that stuff, ordinary people can also just sort of like talk and discuss and have dialogue and discourse about things like the Constitution, about things like our political order, about things like how we understand this country, how we think this country ought to be organized. I think that there is this pervasive belief that helps explain why our Constitution has not been formally amended in quite some time, why so much of our political system seems static on paper at the very least. There's this belief that we are maybe not well equipped to engage in that kind of discussion, engage in that kind of argument. You don't have mainstream politicians really making big constitutional arguments anymore, whereas in the past, in different eras of American politics, partisan politics in a lot of ways was constitutional politics. It was making a claim about what the Constitution said and what it meant, but we don't really see much of that anymore. I think there's a real reticence or reluctance to engage in politics on that level, but I would say that that's exactly what needs to happen. We need to be making claims about what we think the Constitution means to us. We need to be making claims about the kind of political order we want to live under. Because right now, the people in the White House certainly have a vision of the kind of constitutional order they think ought to exist. They certainly have a vision of how they think things should be organized. And there has to be pushback, not just for its own sake, but, there's a good chance that this administration in 2 years faces an opposition Congress. There's always paranoia about what's going to happen with elections, but states run the elections. So we can expect there to be congressional elections in 2 years. And we can expect there's a pretty good chance that there's going to be an opposition Congress. And if there's an opposition Congress, they're not going to be able to do everything they want. The president will still be able to veto anything they pass. But they'll have the opportunity to really shape the public discourse, shape the public dialogue. And if there is no kind of serious conversation about the Constitution, about the things that work and the things that don't, about the ways it might need to change in response to the current situation, what I might call the current crisis, if there's no kind of public conversation like that in the lead up to whatever election comes, whatever the outcome is, then it'll be all the harder to try to make a case for that kind of constitutional discourse once power is in hand. Because once power is in hand, there's a lot of things you want to do, a lot of things you want to take care of. And so I want to close out by just reminding everyone that American politics, even at the level of constitution making, the making of constitutional meaning, that this has never been a game of just elites. And that at every stage of our country's history, ordinary people themselves have made claims, have demanded changes, have demanded new outcomes, have demanded new ways of doing things. That was true of the Revolutionary era, it was true of Reconstruction, it was true of the Progressive era and the New Deal and the Civil Rights Movement and all of that. And it's true now. It remains true that we have agency over what happens in this country. It remains true that the Constitution still belongs to us. The first words are "we the people," and that feels like a cliche, but this is a document based on this idea of popular sovereignty, based on the idea that ultimately its power flows from us. And so I think that if we want the Constitution to remain to be a grant for equality and self-government, which I think is what it is, then we have a obligation and responsibility to be as loud about that as possible, to demand that the people who represent us speak up for these broader values. Again, not to mention eggs again, it's fun to talk about how much eggs are expensive, yeah, Trump took egg, but we got to talk about this higher stuff too, this bigger stuff too. We have to make a case in a way that I'm not sure we've ever had to before. But we have to make a case for American democracy and make a case for constitutional democracy and make a case for a more egalitarian society. Because again, 1 month in, we know what the other side looks like. We know what the case they're making is. And if allowed to advance unimpeded and unchallenged, it's going to leave us in a place where we have lost the closest thing I think Americans can claim to a birthright, which is our democracy. Thank you.
College, because we're a teaching school, I want to call on a student first. I see faculty members' hands up.
Excuse me, Jamelle Bouie. I've actually heard a lot about right-wing populism, but I come from a community of right-wingers. Had to survive, barely. One of them had an Appeal to Heaven flag down my block. You know, that flag that flew over Alito's house. I'm concerned, so I understand why you had to do this because of Trump and Elon and Dodge, but are you concerned? Oh, well, no, that's a good back question. Are you oh my God. What is your biggest concern out of all of this?
My biggest concern is just that it will become the new norm, right? That it'll become the new norm that the president has this sort of autocratic power to cut off funding to programs, to people, to states he doesn't approve of. I mean, so the Doge has access to the Treasury payment system, right? Which is the thing that kind of the mechanics of how the government pays things. It's not really that hard to imagine a situation where I live in Virginia. Let's say we get Governor Abigail Spanberger this year, the Democrat, and next year she doesn't want to cooperate with an ICE operation happening in Falls Church or something. She tells Virginia State Police to not cooperate. What's to stop an unchecked and unbound president from just sort of like turning off Medicaid reimbursements to the state of Virginia? What's to stop an unbound president from turning off Social Security checks to certain zip codes, right? Like that's the kind of authority that they're claiming. And the thing about that kind of stuff is, you know, the Constitution isn't a suicide pact. And so if you're a state and you are in a situation where the federal government is basically stealing from the residents of your state, not giving them the benefits to which they're entitled, and is actively kind of challenging your equal status within the union, like that raises difficult questions about what you do as a state. And the kind of game you could play with this kind of authority leads to something that looks like a fracturing of the American political community. So that's what I'm worried about. Sort of like there's a reason that this is the stuff, precisely the kind of things that the American constitutional order we thought was supposed to prevent and preclude.
Hi, Mr. Bowie. My name is Noah Augustine. And do you think our journalistic institutions are equipped not only to inform of, but also to question the changes in American politics? Why or why not? And if not, what do you think needs to be changed? And I'm sorry, I mispronounced your last name, Bouie.
I was more thinking any honest answer I give, I'm being recorded, you say. Okay. I'm going to give you an honest answer. My honest answer is I am not sure that American political journalists, at the very least, are like actually truly equipped for the kinds of things that we have experienced and are likely to experience. I think there's a strong bias towards normalcy. Lots of talk about media bias. Often that talk is ideological or partisan, but I actually think that there are very few political journalists who are ideologically biased or have strong partisan bias, but there are biases towards normalcy, towards the idea that things will be the way they were tomorrow, like they were yesterday. And that strong bias towards normalcy, which you see, for example, with this dispute between the Associated Press and the White House over Gulf of America, right? And you have outlets who are like, yeah, sure, we'll call it Gulf of America, but it's like, wait a sec, why? Like just because he said it's Gulf of America doesn't mean it's what's called now. And the AP is saying, we serve an international community. We're going to call it the Gulf of Mexico, which is what everyone calls it. And then the White House has banned the AP from the press pool. But the other outlets, they haven't quit or resigned or left the pool in protest, right? You would think that you do that, in protest and solidarity with our colleagues. We're just not going to participate. But there's this bias towards normalcy, right? That I think is like working to circumvent that kind of reaction. So I don't, how to combat this. Part of it might be. I mean, not part of it. The entire thing is reporting on American politics right now, not as if we are in a normal presidential administration under normal circumstances, but as if we are in a process of regime change, right? Some of the smartest commentary I've read about all of this has come from people with foreign reporting experience who can very clearly see what's happening. So, I guess to conclude the answer, I'm not sure that American political journalism, is equipped to handle all of this. I think there are journalists who can, but I do not expect, and I'm not going to expect kind of like your mainstream. Like, I won't expect to open Politico one day and see like a headline about making a kind of argument about the administration doing something illegitimate. Like, it's not going to happen. It's just not how those sorts of outlets engage with this, and I think that's going to be a real problem in communicating to the public like what is happening here.
Go here, and then I'm gonna go there for my coffee, and then I'm gonna come back this way. Here you go.
Thank you. I'm a big fan of yours. I read all your columns. And given what you've said, the one thing that really bothers me, and I'd like you to respond to it, is not necessarily, we know what's going on with the Trump administration and all that sort of stuff. What really bothers me is the fact that we have a weak Democratic Party who hasn't found a way to deal with a Republican Party who's not ashamed of being hypocritical. They have no shame in just doing whatever they want to do and going against everything that they said that they were for, because now it works in their favor, and also being able to change the subject. When you look at any of these talk shows and you're waiting for somebody to stand up to somebody from the other side, they just don't. And I think that, to me, is the problem with these politicians, with our politicians. They're not standing up. And Donald Trump is a son of New York. And so he knows how to play the dozens. And I think that's how he got over, because they didn't have a response to him. And he was just talking street jargon. But to me, what do you think about that? The Democrats are not standing up to these guys.
I think that it's a related answer to with the press. Like, there's a strong normalcy bias, I think, among a lot of Democrats. But more than that, the Democratic Party for such a long time has been it's been this like party of interest and interest groups. I don't mean this in like in a derisive way, right? That's sort of, it has to be that by necessity. It's kind of big, it's diverse and everything. But there's never really been an attempt to articulate any kind of like unifying set of beliefs about like, this is what we think the U.S. ought to be, right? Trump and the Republican Party right now, they have that, which is that we think it should be Donald Trump's playground, right? Like, Trump is this unifying thing. and everyone can redirect back to Trump. But there's no like mission that the Democratic Party has. Really, it seems like, other than to try to win elections, which is just not good enough. I'm a big 19th century history nerd, and I've always been fascinated by the first iteration of the Republican Party from like 1854 to 1877 or so, because it is also this big coalition party. It's a coalition of all the groups that are anti-slavery. Some of them are anti-slavery because they are egalitarians and they hate slavery for moral reasons, and they support the enfranchisement of Black Americans. But that's a very small number. A lot of them are anti-slavery. They're just like, listen, I don't want to compete with Black people with all this free land, right? Like, many reasons for being anti-slavery. But they're all in this big party together. And despite these differences, they're able to articulate really kind of a singular vision. Again, a singular, unified ideological vision, not just about what they want the politics of the country to be, but what they want the Constitution to be, what they want the U.S. to be. And then the first election where Republicans run a presidential candidate, 1856, they have that wonderful slogan. Their nominee is John C. Fremont. And I always get the order of this mixed up, but it's something like free soil, free men, free press, Fremont, right? Like, just sort of the idea being that we want a free society. And whatever our differences, this is the thing that we want, and this is the thing that we're going to center all of our energies on. Can you do something like that with the Democratic Party these days? No. Which is a shame, because there are certainly resources within the history of the Democratic Party to do this exact thing. You can go to FDR's Four Freedoms, right? There are ways to do this, but I think until someone within it can really articulate a vision of what, not of how they want to win, but what they want the country to be, they're going to be flat-footed in the face of Trump. Because that's what it's going to take to, I think, push back on Trump. An actual vision. What do you want this country to be?
I follow you on Blue Sky. My question is, Project 2025 was known, and to the point of the Democratic Party being unprepared, there was absolutely no preparation to say, okay, if Trump wins, this is what we're going to do that counters Project 2025 as a plan, The other part of this is, do you think that American citizens are sufficiently civically engaged? Do people know that they have rights? And do people know that, violating the Constitution is a big deal? Because we're watching this as if gladiators are in the ring and we're going to make a bet on who is the most obnoxious, So this is very strange to me. Finally, Americans know how to report this news, because if it was the global South, they're going to be reporting it differently.
I think that's exactly right. So there are many Americans who are civically engaged. I think I have no proof of this, I should say, from the outset. This is just sort of a thought that I have. The U.S. has been such a stable democracy for so long that I think Americans really take for granted the idea that nothing can kind of fundamentally change for the worse. For as much as I think Americans like to, complain like everyone does about everything, there's, I think, a real deep-seated belief that nothing could fundamentally change the nature of the country. And then when people imagine what a fundamental change to the nature of the country might be like, we're also a culture that's sort of saturated in kind of pop cultural images of authoritarianism and such. So I literally think that when people imagine, autocracy, they imagine that we're all wearing gray sackcloth, and it's like you're sitting in your home and like Big Brother's barking at you from a TV screen, right? It's cultural images that people have, and so they don't see that, and they're like, okay, well, it can't be that serious. And I think part of the challenge is like showing people, and probably through art, right, that authoritarianism on the surface looks like any other place, right? Like if you grow up in an authoritarian country, you're still going shopping for food, you're still eating at restaurants, you're still people having kids. I mean, you should go to concerts. It's not a gray, drab Hunger Games kind of world. It's a world that looks like your own, except that you have far less political freedom than you do now. And I think that part of impressing this upon Americans is impressing on them the real political freedom that they do have. This is why I've always been, and this has always made me like a little humorless, but sort of like I've never really had much tolerance for the kind of like, oh, if voting really meant anything, they wouldn't let you do it. And it's sort of like, okay, well, first of all, they didn't let people who look like me do it for quite a while, so just for accuracy's sake. But second of all, even if our political system is flawed, even if voting doesn't get us everything that we want, it's still like immensely significant that we can choose our own political leaders, and that's like not a small thing. That's not a little thing to give up. And I think kind of making the case for kind of like virtuous engagement with the civic world has to be a part of all of this. The kind of apathy and nihilism about civic life is like actively harmful. I'm just saying this. There's a reason why, in his first campaign especially, Trump was always like, "Well, everyone lies. Well, everyone lies. They all tell lies." Because if you believe that everyone in politics is lying, if everyone in politics is only interested in narrow self-interest, then someone like Trump doesn't seem remarkable. It's like, well, what's the big deal? What's the difference with this lie versus that lie? I think recognizing that for all the flaws, like there are people engaged in political life who are trying to do good by the people they represent, by their communities, that there are ordinary people who engage in politics who do it because they want to help and they want to participate and they want to be good citizens. I think emphasizing that stuff and persuading people that that is the case is just going to be an important part of any kind of renewal afterwards. Like we can't, like cynicism will destroy this country as much as anything else will.
Hi, thank you. You haven't talked much about the courts. And so we have the Supreme Court really an active accessory to this with the immunity decision, especially, and several others. The pardons, I think the Adams dropping of the criminal charges is an important factor. So undermining the court system, could you speak to that?
Sure, yeah. It's really interesting actually to think about how the courts are going to factor into all of this. So obviously right now there are lots of lawsuits being filed, and in many of the courts so far where the lawsuits are landing, they're finding good. They're pushing back because like there's been a lot of just blatant law breaking. At the same time, at the appeals court level, at the Supreme Court, it's clear that there are a bunch of justices who probably are very sympathetic to Trump's claims of sort of like this unilateral executive power. Alito, Thomas, and Roberts in particular have been unitary executive guys for a long time. But I think what's clear to me at the very least is when you grant this formulation for executive power, it necessarily is taking power away from the courts, right? Like you're giving the executive license to just ignore the courts. And if you're John Roberts, who's I think, to my mind, whose like aim over the last 25 years, 20 years, has been to enlarge the authority of the Supreme Court, even the immunity ruling, right? Roberts says, there are official acts and unofficial acts, and unofficial acts touch the president's core duties. And he gives like an example of what this might look like, but Roberts never says, there's no test in that ruling, right? Of this is how you evaluate what constitutes an official act and an unofficial act. This is how you evaluate what constitutes the president's core duty and what doesn't. And I think that's because what Roberts wants is for Roberts people to say that, right? To say like, oh, I think this is an official act. I don't think this is official. I think this is an unofficial act. And so if Roberts' goal this whole time has been sort of just like to enlarge the authority of the Supreme Court, then there's like a bit of a tension here, right? Like you give the president the kind of unilateral authority he wants, and you're ceding a lot of your own. And so I'm curious to see what's just going to happen when these two things conflict, right? Sort of like, okay, the unitary executive theory and the powerful Supreme Court are going to be at loggerheads. And is the court, or at least are 5 members of the court, going to be willing to push back and maybe sacrifice this theory of executive power a bit, or are 5 members going to say, ultimately he's on our side, so we're going to go with him. But that to me is like the question with the courts. Also, I mean, there's the secondary question of like, okay, if they do bend to the president, are they just gonna start rewriting the Constitution? This is my big worry with the birthright citizenship stuff, which, to my mind, it's very clear. It's not really. There are ambiguous things in the Constitution. Every state shall have a Republican form of government. What does that mean? I don't know. I have ideas, but it's debatable. But all persons born in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction therein shall be citizens of the state and the country. It's not really that ambiguous. And so a court that says, oh, well, subject to the jurisdiction means it doesn't apply to the children of undocumented immigrants. I'm like, okay, I guess you're just rewriting this now. And that'll tell us something, too, about the nature of the court that we have.
My question relates to what you said about democratic representation and the media. I've heard our own Brooklyn Congressman, leader Hakeem Jeffries, state Republicans campaign in headlines and Democrats do it in fine print, because Democrats created many of the programs of government and want to explain how they're helpful to citizens. My question is, even if leaders, Democratic leaders, and there is a great bench of leaders, but the media doesn't broadcast any pithy statements they would make. The catchy phrases of John Fremont from 150 years ago could be broadcast by media, but they are cowering. The other side has, in effect, a state media behind them and broadcasts simple, repetitive messages. Big lies are able to imagine if, God forbid, if Goebbels would have had, the media that is prevalent today. So what can we do? What can the cowering media, not broadcasting? Look, you made such a beautiful presentation about the Constitution and how it changes and how we have to protest that. This is, how do we get that on a bumper sticker?
So I sometimes think that there is a powerful right-wing media apparatus, but I think that much of what it does is less about broadcasting pithy statements and more about throwing everything on the wall to see what sticks message-wise, see what resonates with people. I think that the right correctly understands that the thing that you have to capture these days is just people's attention, because the entire media environment is fractured. It's not only broadcast television and newspapers and radio these days. It's if you are trying to reach the typical American who doesn't pay all that much attention to politics, doesn't read a ton of news. They might be scrolling on TikTok. They might be playing a video game. They might be playing on their tablet. They might maybe watch a little TV. They may watch a movie. Their attention's fractured in any number of ways. So it's like, well, how do you get their attention? And what the right's figured out is you just got to scream about everything. And eventually, a lot of people will be attracted to one particular thing that you're screaming about. And then you harp on that. And I think Democrats haven't learned this yet. I think that the Democratic Party's approach to political communication is still in this old paradigm if we can figure out something to put on a bumper sticker and say that a lot, maybe we can get people to pay attention to that. When it really should just be the Democrats encouraging everyone to just get people's attention, however that works. Whatever's passionate to you, individual member, go ahead and try to make a scene about that. And attempt to just capture people's attention. And once you figure out, when 1,000 flowers bloom, right? Like once you figure out the one thing that does capture people's attention, then you harp on that. And I just don't think Democrats have done a particularly good job of capturing attention in that manner. You see glimpses of it sometimes during the campaign. During the campaign, in fact, when Harris took over, it was like everyone's focused on Harris right now. And you could even sense that Trump was like frustrated by the lack of oxygen he was getting. You got to figure out ways to sort of like starve the other side of oxygen in that way by just like sucking up all the attention. And I think that once you get people's attention, then you have a lot more leeway for the kind of messages you want to put out, the kind of things you want to say. But I think getting people's attention is the important thing. I think people just don't really think of Democrats as even like being, out in the world that way, right? Like it's not. No one seems to. Like even me on social media, like I'll come across Republican stuff organically to the extent you can say that, but like. Unless I'm getting something directly served by like AOC's TikTok account, like I'm not really seeing stuff from other Democrats, and that's like the problem.
Thank you so much for coming and such a beautiful, perspicacious lecture and being so generous with your time. And you spoke about the importance of mass mobilization and keeping an issue live and in public debate. And obviously there are parallels to that in American history with slavery and citizenship in the antebellum period, or even in the last 50 years, conservatives kept abortion a live issue. But at the end of that, there's always going to be a portion of the American populace that's part of the kind of Trumpy movement that does agree with unitary executive kind of stuff. So it's difficult for a counter to become a consensus. So ultimately, I think that similar to slavery or abortion, it'll have to collapse into an institutional solution through legislation, through a new constitutional understanding, through a court decision. Do you have any idea what that institutional solution might look like? Do you have something that you hope or wish it'll look like? And do you have ideas of whether it'll be a continuation of maybe the old system and the old regimes, or something new and freer like Reconstruction, like the 14th Amendment, that creates a new political order and opportunities for equality? Thank you.
So one of the things I'll start. One of my like priors, you could say, is that it's like very hard to remake a political system. I think that any substantive change that'll come to the American system is going to have continuities with what came before. Lots of path dependency. But within that, I still think you can. I think you can envision sort of, and in my case, this would be sort of structural political changes and constitutional changes that would, say, put something like the Trump efforts at establishing kind of an executive branch authoritarianism, put them in the rearview mirror. I can envision types of constitutional amendments that would clarify the powers of the presidency, that would clarify the role of Congress, um, that would maybe even weaken the executive branch considerably, that would constitutionalize things like the administrative state and make it clear that like this is a legitimate part of how the American government operates, that would serve to like meaningfully restrict the exercise of executive power. I think that there are a variety of ways in which the political system itself has like led to these outcomes, and there are things you could change through statute or otherwise. So, for example, part of the issue is gerrymandering in the way we do districts and such. But with a simple change of law, right? You can get rid of partisan gerrymandering in the United States. You could enlarge the size of the House considerably, and try to make the House of Representatives like much more representative and inclusive of more people. And also in doing so, maybe try to begin to experiment with like multi-partyism in the United States, which I think is going to likely be part of the solution, in part because there probably is always going to be kind of like an anti-democracy, authoritarian political coalition in this country. And if you can at least split them off from the mainstream, that would go a long ways towards keeping the system healthier. I think that Americans, there has not been a new state in quite a long time. And I think that like thinking about statehood for the various territories of the United States has to be part of the conversation. If part of what I want to see is like greater democratization, then we can't have all these people without political representation under the American flag, and they should all have a choice about whether they want to remain under the flag. And if they do, then we got to give them representation. So that's how I see things. That this like lots of small changes that in the aggregate would actually begin to build out something new. Because I don't think I will be able to ever persuade people that like we should get rid of the Senate and have a unicameral legislature. Like it's never going to happen. We should have prime minister instead of a president. Never going to happen. Like some things we're just going to have. We should consolidate a bunch of small states, and then no one's going to buy that. But there are changes you can make that I think would unsettle the politics of things enough that would create some sort of positive change. Which I should explain myself here. Part of what I think has happened in American political culture is that it seems like nothing can change. Everything seems static. We haven't had a new constitutional amendment, like a real one, since the 1970s. No new states since the 50s. Everything seems static. And I think that there's a desire for something to just push things over a bit, to give some more dynamism to the system. But I think there are things you can do institutionally and structurally that like would introduce more dynamism, more unpredictability, that would like release some of this frustration that I think really does exist. Even if you're not someone like I'm not someone who wants to like tear down the system, but like it's sort of like why do you have to have like 70 senators to pass a bill, right? Like it's silly, right? You can almost understand people who look or lawmakers who are looking the other way with Trump right now, because it's like, well, at least he's doing something. So I can sort of see that, and so it's like, how do you address that in a way that doesn't create a king? Is sort of my concern.
You're an inspiring speaker, and I'm just curious who you who's in your view is an equally inspiring messenger? And is there anyone that you particularly have your eye on that might be a Democratic president in 4 years?
I'm bad at that game. I'm good at saying who is not going to be president. I feel like that's very easy to figure out, right? Like during the Republican primary last year, it was like, yeah, Ron DeSantis might be the guy. It's like, nah, I don't think so, right? Like, I'm very confident about this. But in terms of like who could, I don't know. It's always unpredictable, right? Like I remember after Bush got reelected in 2004, and there was lots of talk of sort of like, oh well, what the American people want is like a good-looking white Southerner, and like John Edwards in North Carolina was like, hey, he said good-looking white Southerner. And then the country elected Barack Obama, right? And even Trump. After 2012, the Republicans put out their autopsy, and the autopsy was like, we've done too much, we've alienated minorities and women too much. We have to have a softer message. We have to pull back on some of this stuff. And then they nominated Donald Trump, who notably alienated minorities and women quite a bit. So, I don't know. I think it's going to be completely unpredictable. And I think if I were giving advice to like the Democratic Party, I would say that the effort to control things and to like select particular people is not, you should not do. Just like let people's talent rise naturally. See who is good at this and go there. But don't try to say, oh, we don't think that person can win, or you don't know. I think it's entirely unpredictable.
We've run out of time, but thank you, everyone, and please thank our visitor.
And that was fantastic, as you could tell. And we had an overflow room upstairs. That was awesome. Oh, great. Thank you so much.
I'm not going to shake hands just because I just blew my nose.